Simone, you and I met just a little over a week ago in your performance with the Great Bay Philharmonic with the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. And I have
Mhm.
to say, I definitely want to touch base on that because it's still really fresh in my brain. You have such command over your instrument, but it was just I'm like lost for words even thinking about it because I was in a section violin, second violin section, and I remember you just walked in, played beautifully, had a couple notes, and then just walked out. It was just incredible.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you. Very kind of you. Great to play with you. I had a really, really good time on stage for that concert.
You played with the Great Bay Philharmonic before, and this is yeah,
Yes.
and but this time you're playing the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. How do you approach Mendelssohn, and can you talk to us about your process and with the composer and with the concerto?
Absolutely. Mendelssohn is a concerto that I think, like most violinists, I've had the opportunity to revisit it many times in my lifetime, starting from youth. It was kind of my first big girl concerto, which I know I have in common with a lot of people, but I played it for the first time. I think at the end of my single digits, like when I was 8 or 9. Um, I have no looking back now, I have no idea how I did that. I don't really want to hear how I did it. I feel like Mendelssohn is one of those concertos that feels more approachable when you have the ignorance of youth. And then you come back to it as an adult, as a college student or a professional, and you realize, oh my gosh, this concerto is incredibly, incredibly challenging. Its challenges, the challenges in it are, I think, range from just really frustrating to also like a great invitation to explore them just for a lifetime. I kind of think of it as almost a perfect concerto in just that there are no movements or lines or anything that I'm like, oh man, that should really be edited, or like, okay, this movement is kind of filler or something. Like every single section of it is special and essential. My favorite thing about the piece is really how complete its narrative trajectory is. Like, I feel in a lot of concertos, you get sort of little vignettes or samples, but Mendelssohn, I feel like the story that begins with the first note before the solo violin even starts playing it, there's a through line from that to the finale of the entire piece. So this journey from anxiety to struggle to contemplation to just the ecstatic triumph of the end, uh, it feels like it's all the same story, and then the joy that is expressed in the end, it feels very, very earned because you've been in it from the very beginning, with not even a gap in between movements.
For me, I find that Mendelssohn Concerto is one of those concertos where I can listen to multiple violinists perform and record it, and somehow yet it's so interesting to hear everyone's perspective on it. It's so unique because it's one of those things where you can recite Shakespeare, but everyone has a different interpretation on to be or not to be, for instance, right? And I found that
Mhm.
to be the case when the entire orchestra was playing, under your guidance, and it was really fascinating to see how you kind of walked on stage for the rehearsal. We maybe had about an hour 15 minutes together. You're so in command of what you wanted to do. Maybe there are like a couple of timing things that we were working on, but you're able to let the orchestra know and the conductor know what you wanted and still tell your story, tell your journey. I think again is one of those moments where a violinist like yourself can be so expressive. And Mendelssohn does that. I have a personal connection with Mendelssohn Concerto because that was a concerto where I auditioned with all my conservatories back in my undergrad. So
Oh
so
wow. Uh-huh.
it was nice to kind of revisit that as well. And again, the ignorance of youth, definitely agree with you. I like it's
Yeah,
just that I just
absolutely.
find that opening to be just so hard.
Oh my god.
It's
It's
so hard.
punishing, but it's also so great. I mean, it's feel like when you get the opportunity to, relax into it and play it as music and not as, second and fourth position, it's amazing. It's like, I mean, it's like the perfect opening sentence. You're immediately hooked.
I would say it is the ultimate hook of a concerto.
Yeah,
It is the ultimate hook,
absolutely.
really. I mean, you have Brahms, which is Brahms concerto, huge orchestral opening. Beethoven, huge orchestral opening. But it
Yeah.
starts with the soloist right away. Are you an up bow person in the beginning or you're a down bow on the beads? You're an up
Upbo.
bow.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I was up bow too, but then
Yeah.
I'm like, maybe the nerves will get to me, so I do down, up, down. So
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. No, I see. I mean, I get really obsessive about that opening in particular, but any opening, like whatever the first couple notes I'm going to play on stage, I in the days or weeks preceding a concert, I play that opening like 10 times a day. It's like the first thing I do in the morning. I do it in between practice sessions. Anytime I'm picking up my violin for the first time after taking a break or something, like the first thing I do is the opening, basically to do it in as many uncomfortable situations as possible, so that on stage, when you're peak nervous, not really relaxed into it yet, it feels just familiar, automatic, or not, automatic, but like physically automatic, so that you can be in it emotionally, interpretively, phrasing everything.
what's fascinating is the preparation leading up to that. So, how do you prepare for a concert and what goes on in your head while you're on stage? Because I find that to be a very interesting topic when it comes to performance anxiety and how to combat performance anxiety. And I was wondering if you have any tips for the Violin Podcast listeners here today.
Sure. I mean, preparation is so specific to whatever the performance is. So something like Mendelssohn, I have played quite a bit. So my preparation for that is very, very different than if I was, doing a concerto for the first time, or even something that I'm a little less familiar with. So I feel like with Mendelssohn, I know mostly like to the day, to the hour where it needs to be. So my preparation for that can be very formulaic, planned. I feel comfortable. That's one of the few ones that I'm like, okay, if I had to, I could knock that out like really quickly. That being said, I never feel like I can really like I don't like I hate being underprepared on stage. So even though I've done Mendelssohn a lot, I'm still doing a lot of slow work, a lot of building work. I'm going through every single thing, like practicing open strings. I'm doing a lot of mental practice, trying to make any piece that you've done before as good as the last time you play it never works for me. I remember my teacher in college and before and after college, Robert Lipset always used to say, like, it's like a shark. If you're not moving, you're always moving in some direction. You're never staying the same. If you think you're staying, sometimes you have to work like you're going forward to just stay in the same place. But if you're trying to stay in the same place, you're usually going backwards. So when I return to a piece, I really do try and make it better or at least different. Uh, and that's actually kind of how I approach performing and nerves as well. For me, there are good nerves and bad nerves. Good nerves focus you. Good nerves are um, really conducive to risk taking, to discovery, to the type of attention that allows you to be so attuned to the moment, to your collaboration, that you know something blooms that could only happen in the specific moment. Those are good nerves. Bad nerves, I usually, to me, feel like uh, a sort of protective contraction. Like whenever I'm bad nervous, I get really selfish. Basically, I get in my own head. I'm thinking about my own hand, my own playing, my own mentality, and usually being a pretty bad listener. So, recognizing that nerves are ego, and usually they draw you, more into yourself. That's also, for me at least, a means to get out of nerves. When I feel myself closing off like that, I really try to lean into listening, try to respond to the situation around me, which is, the other musicians on stage, how the hall sounds, what sort of energy I'm getting from the audience. But if I don't think of a performance as something to be actively crafted in the moment, things go downhill for me. So like when I try and reproduce, like, oh, this is how I sounded in rehearsal, or this is how I tried it in the practice room, like automatic bad. When you have imbibed all the work that you have done in preparation to the extent that you feel sort of comfortable standing on that without thinking about it too much, and then you are able to use that as sort of the ingredients to really like make something new on stage. Those are the best performances. Easier said than done, but trying to actively create something in the moment, rather than uh, sort of retell what is safe. is actually the safer option to me, if that makes any
Sure, yes. I
sense.
mean, these are powerful, powerful tips for any performer, not just violinists who are listening. Couple things you did mention that I wrote down, something that stood out to me that I haven't really thought about more in depth was what you said was nerves as ego. And it's a very kind of inward focus, while when you're performing on stage, you're not trying to
Hmm.
look inward, you're trying to project outward. Like you're not just sound, but ideas, musicality,
Yeah.
energy, synergy, all of that. And I think what you're saying also, correct me if I'm wrong, but the audience can affect your performance a lot. Like
Oh, of
like the
course.
synergy, there's
Yeah.
like this unspoken feeling in the audience that either can give you positive energy or not. And that's, well, the day that
Mhm.
we were performing, I mean, I felt the audience was just like wonderful in the music hall in Portsmouth.
Yes.
So that
Yeah,
was really
overwhelmingly
awesome.
so. Yes.
And also the ability to kind of be conscious of what you're thinking about in the moment, as you said, the whole mental work in your head is really important as well. And I try to teach that to my youngsters. You know, I have a violin studio of from like starting at age 5, and I have, you know, some great students who are definitely on the trajectory of like becoming a pretty great violinist. And that's something we talk about all the time, trying to get out of your head, like positive psychology, positive leadership while playing. And all of that is just super beneficial. I think that's not talked about enough. I want us to dive into the violin that you were playing on during the Mendelssohn. Can you talk to
Mhm.
us about this violin and how were you able to get in touch with this particular instrument?
Yes, so I'm very lucky. I play on a Carlo Bergonzi violin made in about 1745, and it's on loan to me from the Masters University in Santa Clarita, California. I've been playing on it ever since I think June 2019. So it's been a few years. Of course, I didn't get to do a full season on it before, or with it before COVID happened. So our although we've had time to get to know each other, it was like only till later that I had really, played it in halls and with orchestras and sort of explored the sonorities and projection and everything that is required really only in that context. But it is, I'm probably looking over here because I'm looking lovingly at my
Mm.
instrument, but I, I'm a huge, huge, huge fan of this violin. It's taught me a lot. I feel like learning about sound is a lifelong endeavor. The second that I start feeling satisfied, the second I think I start sounding worse. I mean, learning new repertoire is great just because every single piece, every single composer certainly, but even really every single piece requires a different palette, a different sort of sound world to explore. So continuing to do that with this instrument and just exploring violin sound in general is kind of one of the exciting things about, you know, continuing and learning new music.
Yeah, for people who are listening on the Violin Podcast, they're familiar with Amati, Guarneri del Gesù, Stradivari violin, but Bergonzi, not too much. I mean, not that I you know,
Yeah.
I don't see or hear too many violinists on Bergonzi violins. I mean, I hear Viom also, but on Bergonzi, I think you're the first
Mhm.
person I've heard live with that violin, and I feel like you could still you it's like you're like going I feel like you're doing a lot with it already, but it feels to me or it felt to me while on stage, you could go even further with that instrument. I mean, with the sound, the
Yeah,
depth.
it's definitely has a lot of capacity, yes, which I hope to continue to explore. I never feel like I'm maxing it out.
Right, yeah, and that's kind of had me think about the characteristics of a Guarneri violin, and I've had violinists on the Violin Podcast like Kirsten Long. He plays on a Guarneri del Gesù, and it felt like you're just going on a roller coaster ride with that violin on the Bergonzi also. So
Mhm.
it was fascinating to hear. It was fascinating to hear the um, kinds of colors you were able to get out of that instrument alone, which is really really great. Something that I kind of stumbled upon on your website was your reading lists from the pandemic. I feel like back then in 2020, 2021, when everybody was shut down, everybody was at home practicing, trying to create community. Um, what you did was create a list of books that you were reading during the pandemic. And I want us to dive into the topic of literature and history having an effect on our own musical abilities and musicality. And I was wondering if you can chime in on that.
Yeah, reading is definitely my main sort of main other hobby for sure. I rarely it has my bookshelf and like my music stand have sort of been in communication my whole life. But that's rarely because I think of reading in terms of like musical utility. It's honestly just something like I love so much that the sort of synesthetic connections between like literature that excites me and music that excites me kind of happened um naturally. I used to I feel like think about music a little more programmatically like when I was really really young and
As
I
most
I
young
would
kids do, I felt like I do
yeah, of
that too.
course. You're like, "Oh, there's this
You want
part."
to think of a
Of course.
story. I definitely thought of Mendelssohn as a
Yeah,
story, although it's not
absolutely.
trying to intend to be. So yeah, I felt that way
Yeah,
too.
exactly.
And
And
also, I don't want to suggest that the literature that you're reading is like directly corresponding to the musical stuff that you were working on. It's just interesting to kind of um, talk about that, to not be in our music in our music stands, but being outside of our
for
music
sure.
stands. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, all of those things, like thinking about music in terms of characters and thinking about music and even in terms of literary devices, where I'm like, okay, this phrase is a run on sentence. How do I fit? That has been like genuinely really helpful for me. Sometimes uh, thinking about music in only musical terms, it feels so stuck that all you need is like a synonym or a comparison or something, and all of a sudden it sort of unlocks an understanding. So well, now I don't think of music usually in terms of like I'm going to transfer this character or this plot point into this concerto or whatever. Sometimes I'm searching for the right sound or color feels like searching for the right word. There's like the verbal precision of literature. Um, what that can lend music and exploration is really, really interesting to me. Um, I also just read completely separate from, I guess, any interpretive efforts. I definitely do read to just like stay sane on the road. Honestly, in a similar vein to what I was just talking about with nerves, just as nerves on stage are all about ego, I feel like anxiety in general, certainly my anxiety on when I'm, traveling or just in the general mind space of like a lot of performances coming up, it's a reliable beat of like I, me. Um, Getting outside yourself, usually with fiction or with nonfiction, with anything, with a narrative or words of any sort, um, is probably one of the most like reliable mental health tools, I guess, to use a buzzword for me. But I just genuinely do find it helpful. If I'm not reading something and I'm on the road, usually I'm in a bad mood and getting lonely and just like not a good time. So
and we don't want that from you. We want you to be at your best because we want you playing beautifully.
yeah, exactly. I want to play well and I also want to be a nice person. So knowing that that is something that at least facilitates those, it doesn't do all the work, but is something that definitely keeps me in it.
I applaud all the violinists who have solo careers such as yourself about, staying on the road and staying sane, as you say, staying, you know, staying focused. It's very easy to, lack the focus when you're on the road. Sometimes a flight can get delayed. People don't realize this. Sometimes a visa doesn't get issued when you're traveling to a different country.
Mhm.
Um, Delays, weather, and then I'm thinking in the top of my head, Stefan Jakiv going to New Jersey in a taxi cab with all this traffic from New York City, and he had to practice in the cab. It was a famous story many years ago. I think it was on the violinchannel.com.
Yeah.
But that's something that I think about all the time. Like I tell my students, you have to be ready no matter what. Sometimes
Mhm.
you don't get the luxury of warming up every single time, but no matter what life kind of throws at you, there'll never be such a thing as like a perfect performance.
Totally. Yeah, always stuff. I feel like uh, I've become more generous watching performances, honestly, as I've gotten older, because I'm like, oh, wait, there's always something going on. Like, there is always something happening backstage. I don't know if anybody walks on stage and is like, wow, okay, today I had perfect preparation. I'm happy with everything in my life. There's nothing going on personally that's like distracting. There's always something going on. Um, but show must go on. Sometimes it can feed it, sometimes it can take it away. I don't think there's any secret ingredients. A lot of what, I get superstitious when I'm really, really nervous. And I'm like, okay, when this performance went well, I did this, I ate this, I slept exactly like this. This is how I mental practice. I don't think it works. Like sometimes it happens. Sometimes you do everything right and it just feels awful up there. I still don't understand, but I'm going to keep trying.
Sure, I find that to be the case where if I'm performing or if I'm prepping for something, I don't want things to go too well. You know what I mean? That I get superstitious when things go
I
almost too well
understand. Yeah.
because if something goes too well, then I know that, it's kind of like a water in a cup where I'm just pouring all this water in a cup and then all of a sudden it's going to overflow and you know what I mean? So I feel
Yeah.
like eventually something bad will happen. So I want us to play a little game that we haven't done on the Violin Podcast, and I feel like you would be a great candidate for this. Overrated or underrated? And I'm gonna say a few words.
Oh, I just said I'm ready to be the guinea pig.
Yes, please do, because I'm always looking for ways to engage with our audience, and I feel like this is gonna be really fun. So either you say
Okay.
overrated, underrated, and we talk about it. So the first one I have
Okay.
scales.
Um, the only thing I could possibly say is underrated. Even though scales get a lot of hype, they deserve more hype. I think scales are everything. I'm a huge believer in scales.
Another
Um,
option is properly rated. I guess I should say that. I feel like scales can be properly rated.
okay, I'm still gonna say underrated because uh, I feel scales are emphasized a ton when you're in school. I'm only going to say underrated because I felt myself not giving them their due diligence and due credit until pretty recently. This past fall, I guest taught a little bit at the University of Michigan in the studio of Danielle Belen because she was on sabbatical. So I was there for a couple weeks at a time for a month total, basically working with her really great studio. And I had never taught that consistently before. And it had me sort of in this headspace where I'm like, I'm going to go back to the basics. I'm going to wake up every day and do some sevjik, do some scales. And I just realized that like I play scales every day. I always have. But I realized that I was just like playing scales every day.
Mm.
I was not devoting the attention to playing them perfectly. Like how would I play them if someone was in a room? And all of a sudden, I'm in the hallway practicing in my studio at University of Michigan. My students are walking by. It had me, practicing with good posture, exactly, trying to be an example. And I swear to God, I practice scales like with, way more attention for like 2 weeks. And I added some, shifting exercises and also some one finger scales just to get really nitty gritty with it. And I was like, oh my God, I've never felt better in moving around the violin. Like I felt so stupid that I had just let myself let scales become just sort of a passing obligation rather than something to truly 100% devote your attention to every day. So I was underrating scales, so I'm just going to project that onto the world and say scales are underrated.
You heard it yourself on the Violin Podcast first, ladies and gentlemen. Scales underrated. Continue to do them. Next word, competitions.
Ooh, I guess probably properly rated, and I think I don't feel like I'm the greatest person to talk about this, having never really done a major competition. The last competition I did was at Aspen Music Festival when I was 14. I didn't place or anything. And so I never really, participated in like the really, really big, incredibly demanding competition. So I don't have any personal experience. Probably properly rated in that they are an incredible tool for so many people, both in terms of career and training. The uh the positives of the exposure and demands have been very documented, as well as the negatives of, fairness or strain or any of it. They're a great tool. They're not the only tool, but I feel like there's generally pretty good discourse about uh, who they work for, um, what they work for, and how one can properly use them. Lots of careers have been spurred forward by competitions. It's never going to be just that. There's a lot of before and after, but yeah.
I would say overrated for the sole reason
You would say
that
overrated.
you just said, because you may have done maybe one competition. I've done competitions maybe when I was in my youth also, but never I got like an honorable mention somewhere. But I would put it in two categories. Properly rated for someone who is wanting to get better, like get to the next level in terms of their performance and their musicianship. I think that's
Mhm.
great. I think in terms of having a music career, well, where if you feel like that is the end game, where okay, I'm going to win a competition, then my life will be set, I think it's overrated in that sense. So I
Yeah.
think if you put it in two categories, I think it could definitely shape the trajectory on how you kind of approach the violin in that sense. So it's good. This is great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. Yeah.
But it's okay to disagree with me, please. I love to disagree with people.
Oh, no, no. I actually am really on board with everything you're saying. They're definitely not a fix all at all. And I think you could easily argue that connections and relationships are much more important, and that even if you win a competition, it is totally on you to cultivate and sustain yourself with connections and relationships.
Mhm. All right, next one. We talked about Mendelssohn, but I'm going to say Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. Overrated or underrated?
Properly rated. It's played all the time. All the time. Sometimes I get asked to play Mendelssohn so much that I'm like, ugh. But it's so good. It really, really, like you said, it is such a joy to perform. I love listening to it. I love hearing it live. Do I think that there should be more diversity in programming of violin concertos? Hell yeah. But I think Mendelssohn is beloved for good reason, honestly.
I would say properly rated also. Can't go wrong with the guy. Can't go wrong with the concerto. Just can't.
Mhm.
The next one, old violins. Overrated or
Um,
underrated?
as someone who performs, has the great opportunity to perform on an old violin, I would say properly rated in that I wouldn't want to be playing on anything else. Overvalued in that they're completely inaccessible to players. But I also understand that we are preserving a moment in history and a work of art in addition to, an instrument like a tool or whatever. Um, New violins sound great. I am a fan of modern instruments for sure. I love hearing someone play, asking them what that is, and like finding out that it's, a modern maker. They sound fantastic. I have never I haven't had that much opportunity. I've never performed on a modern instrument or anything, and I haven't had really any opportunity to play them in like large spaces where you really find out what's going on. So for me, like, I'm very, very happy to be playing on my instrument, and I have never so far encountered anything that really makes the leap from small room to like giant room, as well as like these crusty old Italians. um but I'm certainly open to all other types of violins. I feel like you're going to say overrated.
Actually, I'm going to say underrated. And this,
Oh, no
I
way.
think
Okay.
it's actually underrated. And I am going to share my 2 cents on the Violin Podcast if people care. I think that they are actually underrated because the violin is worth nothing without the player itself, in my opinion. So you
Mhm.
cannot make beautiful art, musically speaking, if you don't have the training for it. I feel like going back to the earlier comment in the beginning, where I feel like that Bergonzi violin that you were playing on still has a lot more to give. And in terms of the pricing, yeah, it's overrated, but I feel like the overall historical world value of the instrument
Mhm.
continues to go up. and it continues to be talked about. And no matter what, like you see a Granary selling for 14 million in the news, it somehow continues to grab attention because a lot of people are
Yeah.
investing in this art. And the only way it's
Mhm.
worth that much is because of the people who continue to play on them. So that way they're still in the mix in the performance. If a Strat violin is not
Mhm.
performed on, it's worth nothing. I would say. I mean, maybe Stradivari is a bad example, but because but you understand what I'm saying. The one last thing I do want to ask you before I let you go, and you've been so generous with your time. I really appreciate it. I just like rumbled and
Oh, no,
bambled
thank you for having
just a
me.
moment ago, but I want to ask for some tips or some violent advice that you can give to our audience that will help them maybe with short-term gain in terms of violin technique, musicality, skills, whatever the case may be, or if you can offer some long-term like goals for people to think about.
Okay, yeah. I'm gonna go from micro to macro
Yeah.
here, but okay. Short term, the thing I just talked about with my sort of scales renaissance was one of the things that really changed things for me was one finger scales, and I started doing those actually because I called up my previous teacher Robert Lipset and I said my left hand's feeling kind of bad. Like, what should I do to get myself in shape again? And he was like, "Have you ever tried one finger scales?" And I never had. So I started doing them, and it's literally what it sounds like. You know, going up a string on one finger, basically for one octave, doing a major scale, a melodic minor, harmonic minor, and then all the arpeggios. And the idea is you do it so slowly, like disgustingly slowly, that you do not miss. Like it's not like oh you do it until you get it right. No, you literally do it so slowly. Sometimes it's like taking you 10 seconds to get in between
Is
notes.
that all on one string? Like one like so you're
Yes.
all doing it on one string. Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah, one string, one finger. So I started doing those every day, and I would do one string a day on every finger. And all of a sudden, like my fluency with the violin got so much better, and now you know I can play them faster now. I mean, I still do them really slow, but not like you know grass is growing multiple bows to get you know move a half step. Um, that was something that I wanted to shout to the heavens just because it felt like uh uh very generous in terms of what it offered in the short term. Second thing is practice open strings all the time. That is the one that's something that if I've ever if you ever had a lesson with you, I've probably made you play things on open strings. That's probably my biggest obsession. Um, I try not to think about my left hand on stage except in very specific moments. If I think about this, this is where my ego is, this is where my anxiety is, this is usually where um my this is where my brain that executes rather than my brain that expresses is. So I really like to think about my right hand. That's where the phrasing is, that's where the line is, everything. I practice open strings like crazy, both for passage work. Most of the time, if you haven't practiced that well and you ask someone, play this, you know, string crossing passage or something fast or whatever on open strings, like without your left hand, cannot do it. And that's totally fine. That makes sense. Usually your right hand is following. However, I do think that it is a weakness when this hand can't act independently. So, sort of bulking it so that the right hand knows what it's doing completely autonomously, I feel is essential. So I use open strings work a ton in passage work, but also in slow melodic lines and everything. If I know a piece well, there is not a single measure that I haven't done on open strings, and I do that every day. That's a lot of times that's what I'm doing honestly backstage right before I walk out on stage, just because I want to be in this feeling. I want to feel the line as it exists here rather than as it exists here. Um, I guess third, like larger piece of advice is um, learn repertoire that's outside your comfort zone and learn from how it requires you to think. Again, this is speaking totally from personal experience. I feel like I learned how to mental practice, and how to sort of reapproach the standard repertoire that you've just absorbed through osmosis and heard a bazillion times, and maybe you're playing a little bit automatically because I started playing new music that either wasn't recorded or hadn't been recorded that much. Uh, Learning work from like living composers, apart from just being genuinely so fulfilling and interesting, and like I did it for pleasure rather than for, uh, education, honestly. But I learned so much from having to really look at a score and figure out, what is this phrase asking from me? Like, what is this note within the context of this line? What is it within the context of this piece? Like, what am I actually being asked for this? Are there multiple ways? And I learned how to mental practice with pieces that I didn't understand the phrasing for. Like, I mental practice now. I try to feel it like as viscerally as possible. So, like, I've tried to really feel the sort of tension of a line in my body rather than just reading the music. I didn't know how to do that before I started doing pieces that I was unfamiliar with, and that taught me so much about how to approach something like Mendelssohn. Like, I realized how many phrases within those pieces I was just playing because I had heard them that way. And it can work because usually, we're hearing great people play, but it's much less personal. It's much less interesting. Um, it's really interesting and inspiring and like pleasurable to develop the type of relationship with a score where you have poured over every single phrase and sort of interrogated it and let it interrogate you. Um, so I feel like the way to really learn how to do that is playing a lot of different things that challenge you in different ways. But yeah, off the top of my head, those are my three hot takes.
All of that was so amazing and powerful. I hope you're taking notes on that. So, friends, this is Simone Porter, full time violinist, and you can hear her on tour with her schedule by going to simoneporter.com and checking out her schedule. And I believe you're on social media also, right? You're on Instagram. So, what's the best way
Yep.
to get in touch with you on Insta?
I'm at Simone Port.
Simone Port.
So
And I'll leave
yeah.
all the links to her social media in the podcast show notes. So definitely take a look at that. Simone, such an amazing conversation. I learned so much. I hope people listening also learned a lot. So really thank you for your time and thank you for offering your life as a violinist. Thanks so much.
My true pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Eric. Great to talk with you and to play with you last week.